Mr. Speaker, I wish to raise the case of 2nd Lieutenant Sassoon of the 3rd Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers. This young officer appears to have one of the finest and most gallant records of service in the army. He enlisted as a private without waiting for the war to break out in 1914. He has been wounded and has been awarded the Military Cross for conspicuous gallantry. About 3 weeks ago, this young officer came to see me and told me he had written this letter to his commanding officer. I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe
that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier convinced that I'm acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I believe that if the purposes for which I and my fellow soldiers entered upon this war had been made so clearly, that it would have been impossible for them to change them, and that had this been done, the objects which actuated us would now be attained by negotiation. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolonging those sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. I am not protesting against the conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. On behalf of those who are suffering now, I make this protest against the deception which has been practiced upon them. Also, I believe that it may help to destroy the callous complacence with which the majority of those at home regard the agonies which they do not share and which they have not sufficient imagination to realize.
What this young officer anticipated has occurred. After some delay, he was forced to appear before a medical board, and the board, having heard the opinions expressed in the letter, informed him that he must be suffering from a passing nervous shock due to the effects of his terrible experiences at the front. He was sent to a hospital for officers suffering from shell shock and other minor ailments. I read that letter because I think, however profoundly honourable members may disagree from it, that it contains no indication whatever of having been written by a man suffering from any kind of nervous shock. The fact is that the decision of the medical board is not based upon health, but based upon very easily understood reasons of policy. It was quite clear that it was the easiest way to avoid publicity.
One morning, at the beginning of August, when I'd been at Craig Lockhart War Hospital about a fortnight, there was a gentle knock on the door of my room, and a young officer entered. Short, dark-haired, and shyly hesitant, he stood for a moment before coming across to the window where I was sitting on my bed, cleaning my golf clubs. A favourable first impression was made by the fact that he had under his arm several copies of my poems, The Old Huntsman. He had come, he said, hoping that I would be so gracious as to inscribe them for himself and some of his friends. He spoke with a slight stammer, which was no unusual thing in that neurosis-pervaded hospital. My leisurely, commentative method of inscribing the books enabled him to feel more at home with me. He had a charming, honest smile, and his manners, he stood at my elbow rather as though conferring with a superior officer, were modest and ingratiating. He gave me the names of his friends first, and when it came to his own, I found myself writing one which has since gained a notable place on the roll of English poets. Wilfred Owen. I'd taken an instinctive liking to him and felt that I could talk freely. During the next half an hour or more, I must have spoken mainly about my book and its interpretations of the war. He listened eagerly, questioning me with reticent intelligence. It was only when he was departing that he confessed to being a writer of poetry himself, though none of it had yet appeared in print. It amuses me to remember that when I'd resumed my ruminative club polishing, I wondered whether his poems were any good. For him, on the other hand, the visit to my room, as he subsequently assured me, had been momentous. It had taken him 2 whole weeks, he said, to muster up enough courage to approach me with his request. I must add that in a letter to his mother shown me many years afterwards, he reported me as talking badly.
He accords a slurred suggestion of words only. The last thing he said to me as I left his room was, "Sweat your guts out writing poetry." He also warned me against early publishing. He himself is 30, looks under 25.
And on September the 7th, he wrote,
Sassoon called me into him, and having condemned some of my poems, amended others, and rejoiced over a few, he read me his very last works, which is superb beyond anything in his book. I don't tell him so, or that I'm not worthy to light his pipe. I simply sit tight and tell him where I think he goes wrong.
We began to meet regularly to discuss our work. But it was, however, not until sometime in October, when he brought me his splendidly constructed sonnet, Anthem for Doomed Youth, that it dawned on me that my little friend was much more than the promising minor poet I had hitherto adjudged him to be.
What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds.
Does it matter? Losing your legs, for people will always be kind. And you need not show that you mind when the others come in after hunting to gobble their muffins and eggs. Does it matter? Losing your sight? There's such splendid work for the blind, and people will always be kind as you sit on the terrace, remembering and turning your face to the light. Do they matter, those dreams in the pit? You can drink and forget and be glad, and people won't say that you're mad, for they know that you fought for your country, and no one will worry a bit.
He sat in a wheeled chair waiting for dark, and shivered in his ghastly suit of grey, legless, sewn short at elbow. Through the park, voices of boys rang, saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. About this time, town used to swing so gay, when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees, and girls glanced lovelier as the air grew dim. In the old times, before he threw away his knees. Now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are, or how warm their subtle hands. All of them touch him like some queer disease. There was an artist, silly for his face, for it was younger than his youth last year. Now he is old, his back will never brace. He's lost his colour very far from here, poured it down shell holes till the veins ran down laps in the hot race, and a leap of purple spurted from his thigh. One time, he liked a blood smear down his leg. After the matches, carried shoulder high. It was after football when he had drunk a peg. He thought he'd better join. He wonders why. Someone had said he'd look a god in kilts. That's why. And maybe too to please his Meg. Aye, that was it. To please the giddy jilts. He asked to join. He didn't have to beg. Smiling, they wrote his lie, aged 19 years. Germans, he scarcely thought of. All their guilt and Austrias did not move him. And no fears of fear came yet. He thought of jewelled hilts for daggers in plaid socks, of smart salutes and care of arms and leave and pay arrears, and soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. Some cheered him home, but not as crowds cheer goal. Only a solemn man who brought him fruits, thanked him, and then inquired about his soul. Now, he will spend a few sick years in institutes and do what things the rules consider wise and take whatever pity they may dole. The night he noticed how the women's eyes passed from him to the strong men that were whole. How cold and late it is. Why don't they come and put him into bed? Why don't they come?
We'd gained our first objective hours before, while dawn broke like a face with blinking eyes, pallid, unshaved and thirsty, blind with smoke. Things seemed all right at first. We held their line with bombers posted, Lewis guns well placed, and clink of shovels deepening the shallow trench. The place was rotten with dead. Green, clumsy legs, high-booted, sprawled and grovelled along the saps, and trunks, face downward in the sucking mud, wallowed like trodden sandbags loosely filled. And naked, sodden buttocks, mats of hair, bulged. Clotted heads slept in the plastering slime. And then the rain began, the jolly old rain. A yawning soldier knelt against the bank, staring across the morning blear with fog. He wondered when the Allemans would get busy. And then, of course, they started, with 5 9s traversing sure as fate and never a dud. Mute in the clamour of shells, he watched them burst, spouting dark earth and wire with gust from hell, while posturing giants dissolved in drifts of smoke. He crouched and flinched, dizzy with galloping fear, sick for escape, loathing the strangled horror and butchered frantic gestures of the dead. An officer came blundering down the trench. "Stand to and man the fire step!" And on he went, gasping and bawling, "Fire step! Counter-attack!" And then the haze lifted. Bombing on the right down the old sap, machine guns on the left, and stumbling figures looming out in front. Oh Christ, they're coming at us. Bullets spat, and he remembered his rifle, rapid fire, and started blazing wildly. Then a bang, crumpled and spun him sideways, knocked him out to grunt and wriggle, None heeded him. He choked and fought the flapping veils of smothering gloom, lost in a blurred confusion of yells and groans. Down and down and down he sank and drowned, bleeding to death. The counterattack had failed.
Out there, we walked quite friendly up to Death, sat down and eaten with him, cool and bland, pardoned his spilling mess tins in our hand. We've sniffed the thick green odour of his breath. Our eyes wet, but our courage didn't writhe. He spattered us with bullets and his coughed shrapnel. We chorused when he sang aloft. We whistled while he shaved us with his scythe. Old Death was never an enemy of ours. We laughed at him. We leagued with him, old chum. No soldiers paid to kick against his powers. We laughed, knowing that better men would come, and greater wars. When each proud fighter brags, he wars on death for life, not men for flags.
Good morning, the General said when we met him last week on our way up the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of them dead, and we're cursing his staff for incompetent swine. He's a cheery old card, grunted Harry to Jack as they slogged up to Arras with rifle and pack. But he did for them both with his plan of attack.
Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing.